why do you think that neither the British side made much in terms of leaving an account of all of this, or even the nationalist side? Somehow these stories exist in families and silences and memories like that. But until your book came around, nobody really had sat down and thought that this was a story worth telling. That silence, was it conscious, or was it simply because nobody who was likely to tell the story felt they had anything to gain by telling that story?
Yeah, good question. I wondered about this myself. I think one of the reasons is that traditionally historians have focused on the freedom movement. Even British historians, but they only called it the transfer of power, where we called it a struggle for freedom. So this story actually slipped between the cracks because no one was paying attention to this, and finally it was a non-event. The Japanese didn't invade, so I think that played a role as well. So I think these are some of the reasons that it slipped through the cracks. The other thing is that you'd imagine that if 75 to 90%, 75% definitely, possibly much more, if 75 to 90% of Madras evacuated, you would imagine that the newspapers of the time, including the one I edited, would have photographs of empty streets or long reports of what was happening. There's very little of that, because the newspapers themselves, and I'm not particularly critiquing the Hindu or any other paper, because the newspapers of the time themselves were essentially focused on politics and statements and so on. There was very little human interest. If you mind the newspapers of that time, there was very, very little human interest stories at that time. Essentially, in the book, I suggest that there were a series of very, very important things that were happening in India which have really not been properly recorded at all. And essentially this was a result of a fear that the Japanese would invade India, which arguably was not a completely unreal fear, because the Japanese actually came close. They sent aircraft carriers into the Indian Ocean. They bombed places like Visakhapatnam and Kakinada and parts of the northeast. But they never had any intention of invading India. But the British took measures, and I argue in the book, that actually stoked a great sense of panic, and people fled from pretty much all over the country. I know people are aware that there was an evacuation of Madras, but I don't think many people know that it's possible that almost 90% of Madras could have fled. In Kodaikanal, Americans and British people, American missionaries, the Kodai school was founded by American missionaries, they fled because a rumor had taken root, and this was a time of great rumors. There were absurd rumors about, there's a rumor about, I'll give you one or two. There's a rumor about a Japanese man who's supposed to have landed in a parachute in a place, address a crowd, and then gone back up in his parachute to the sky. And the people believed all these kinds of things.